Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. I'm Andrew Cohn. This month, we are featuring an unusual book. It's a little bit older, 1991. It's not a business book. It's not a research book. It's not written by a famous author of the type that we typically feature in this book club, although we do sometimes highlight lesser-known authors. But it's a great recommendation that came from Zach Jaffe on our team, called The Listening Book, Discovering Your Own Music by W.A. Mathieu, who's a composer, a teacher, a musician. And it's a fascinating book about life, about learning, about finding our own wisdom and guidance and finding our own center. And it just uses music. That's the place it's coming from. So it's a wonderful little book about leadership and learning and overcoming resistance and connecting to ourselves, setting ourselves free from the tyranny of our thinking minds is something else that's in here. It's about finding playfulness, finding our natural rhythms. It is also about learning to play music, although I will de-emphasize that portion. Let me read a portion of the introduction, and I'll be using this book back and forth. I have some notes in front of me, but there'll be times when I'm reading here. He says, listening is receptive. You allow something outside your body to come inside into your deep brain, into your private of privates. To listen is to be vulnerable, to be open and impressionable, to hear everything. It's dangerous. You can be damaged all too easily. But if you're shut tight against the world, you can't receive nourishment. The problem is how to be open enough and safe enough at the same time. The resolution is a matter of balance, of discriminating between receptivity and self-defense. This book teaches you how to listen safely and openly to the world around you. And it also teaches you how to listen to the music within you. So, quick overview of the book. That was the end of the introduction. And then there are 5 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections, or 6 if you count the brief conclusion. And in each one, there are little essays that range from 1 to 3 pages, and that's it. You get the feeling that the author didn't sit down and write this in one shot, but he put down a lot of his learnings and his wisdom and his experiences and his invitations, and then aggregated them into these 5 sections, which I'll describe briefly, and then highlight some things from each section. As he says in the introduction, the 5 sections are arranged from passive to active, from appreciation of everyday life sounds. So appreciation of everyday life sounds is quite passive. It's very open, could have a lot of application, to participation in musical practices. And that section is really more narrow about literally how to practice music and how to learn to be a musician and practice effectively. And then he encourages the reader to skip around, see what has most value, etc. I won't be focusing on the last section too much because that's really about learning to play and literally has suggestions about playing scales on the piano and listening to strings resonate in different ways. But there's even something quite valuable about leadership at the end, which I'll circle back to. Some of the earlier sections, though, are really quite lovely. So we could start with the first section, which is called Listening. And in here, he talks about the love of sound, about focusing on our ears as opposed to the eyes. He talks about focusing on the sound horizon, which is interesting. There's a sound horizon. Can we train ourselves to hear it the way we could train ourselves to see the visual horizon? There's a wonderful line in the early part of the book that I think is really thematic of the entire book. And he says, the nature of sound works in your favor and rescues you time and time again from the tether of the mind, which I think is a lovely, certainly a lot of application there in our world of leadership development and executive coaching and otherwise. There's a brief chapter in this section called Symphonies of Place, and he talks about being present to hear the symphonies happening around us. So he has something in here that I could read called Symphony Number 2. Anyway, the encouragement here is to listen to what's happening around us, tune in, and then write it down. And the act of writing focuses us on what we're listening, brings us present, So symphony number 2, downtown Santa Rosa, California. It's a summer evening, after dinner, but still daylight. I'm on the perimeter of a pedestrian area surrounded by shops, a restaurant, a movie theater, sitting on a stone ledge near the theater entrance. I hear the footsteps of a couple passing by. The guy's keys hit against his belt. 30 yards away, city traffic, light trucks and cars. The big glass door of the theater opened with a squeak and closed with a whoosh and a click. The high whine of an engine, a truck tailgate slams open, and it continues. But this is a lovely exercise about sound and training yourself to hear. From my point of view, it's a lovely exercise about presence and getting present. He taught creating a sound space. We talked about that. It's about tuning in, which is my term, not his. There's a section here about protecting your ears and literally how to protect your ears. And go ahead and ask the waitress to turn down the ambient noise to protect your ears. And I liken that honestly to protecting our gifts. And what do we need to protect in order to be respectful and honoring of our gifts? He talks about preparing a sound space, which is in many ways like preparing a focused space, preparing a space. I was just coaching a client a few days ago who was talking about the need to prepare a space for strategic thinking in a big corporate job, because that kind of space doesn't happen by itself. We have to create it, almost to create an altar. He talks about something like that, but almost to create an altar or something else that creates the conditions within which we can really hear. Not that we'll be able to necessarily always control what we can hear, but the need to prepare a sound space and the value of that. He talks about unlistening and ways to tune out from distractions and the like, and other similar invitations to listen more deeply, listening more deeply to people. And there's, at the end of this section, there's a wonderful, wonderful little chapter called 20 Sounds to Get Lost In. And he invites us to get lost in wind chimes, 2 music boxes or 3 at once, rain, river, waterfall, crickets, frogs, wind around corners, your own breathing, people hammering at a construction site, the cross rhythms, radio tuned between 2 music stations so you can hear both equally. And it continues. Again, another opportunity to tune in and listen. So this section is really about, as it says, it's about listening. And there's just some lovely pieces in here that are certainly worth looking at, especially that, like I said, that first section about listening. The second section is about joining in, and joining in means joining in with the music, connecting with the music. It begins with a brief section. Each section, again, is between 1 and 3 pages about resonance. And he says, like things vibrate alike. Everything is resonant or nothing is. So how can we be aware of that? We need to find the special resonances that affirm our lives, that make us feel in tune with the way things are. He says, when 2 strings are tuned to the same pitch, their vibrations are synchronized 1 for 1. They're in step, in tune, and each reinforces the other's energy, like the good feeling that arises when you walk in step with your close friend. Resonance, in this sense, is the very core of musical experience. When you move with music and sing and play in tune with it, you are feeding its energy and it is feeding yours. This is the musician's heaven world. As you become more conscious of resonance, that heaven grows wider, more vivid, and more down to earth where people can use it. It's a lovely little section. He talks about joining in music by walking, by singing with machines. There's a lovely few pages in here about humming along and harmonizing with the dial tone on a telephone. I'm dating myself. Remember when there were dial tones? I don't know. He talks about life drummer and being a life drummer, as he calls it. And I'll just read a few portions from this section, which is lovely. How else am I going to find out what the world is made of than by thumping and whacking on it, jostling the secret loose with a little loving persuasion? Drums are an abstraction of mammalian form, skin outside, hollowness inside. The body is the first drum. Less obvious are tabletops, ladder rungs, car roofs. He says, I play my dog. He thinks his belly is a drum and his cranium is a gourd and his long snout is a bamboo marimba. Everything has a sound, he says. Don't be shy. A tap with your finger might reveal a holy book. A life drummer, as he calls himself, or someone who participates this way, cannot pass a window, a fence, a pole without knocking or stroking out the sound of it. Let nothing be safe, he says, except the ears of others. So I liken this to, I had an image when I read this of, I don't know if you've ever seen the video clip of Albert Einstein walking past a metal fence in Princeton, knocking his umbrella along every vertical metal railing of that fence. That there's a connection, a joining that happens when we whack on things, when we're a life drummer, which is something that he talks about in a beautiful way. He talks about gibberish of a baby and how they do it so naturally. He talks about chanting and just how chants naturally arise in different places where there's groups of people. As he says, sports, opera, prayer, children's games, political action, the sound of collective intention, as he calls chanting. And very importantly, there's a section in here called willing silence, or being willing to place ourselves in silence and receive the benefits of silence. For him, he's talking about it as a tool to connect with the music, with the sounds inside us. I love it for that meaning, and I love it for the meaning of tuning into ourselves and being grounded and listening better to ourselves. So I'll just read a portion of the willing silence section. There's no such thing as pure silence, not in the world we know. And yet we do experience what can be called relative quiet, the impression of silence. And this can be vivid and compelling. We are drawn to it. We're hungry for it, and it nourishes us. In a brief moment of quiet sitting, we can realize how tranquility is the precondition for listening. Which reminds me about a wonderful book that we featured in this series a couple of years ago called Humble Inquiry, and how listening is so critical to leadership. Our sense of silence is the other side of our sense of sound and gives definition and wholeness to it. I think if you do your silence homework, the ideal of silence will come close to you in unexpected moments. When you bend your will toward silence, you will find the effort life-giving. Willing yourself toward silence is the quintessential practice, the springboard for music. You could do a swan dive from it and enter directly into your work without making a sound. It's a lovely invitation to focus on silence as a baseline for what it is that we do and to doing it better and in a more focused way. The next section is called practicing. So there are lessons in here about literally practicing an instrument, persevering, overcoming resistance, all of which are leverageable to the leadership work that we typically focus on. And there's a beautiful philosophy in here as well, in addition to practical recommendations. So it talks about overcoming resistance. I put in a plug here for a wonderful book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, and maybe that's one we should feature in this book club at one point, about overcoming resistance as just critical for any type of creative endeavor. He talks about, well, there's a section here called Telephoning Counts. Says, at first the idea of practicing music comes from afar, like the idea of going to the tropics or getting married or building your own house. And the important thing is to allow the impulse to root and blossom in its own natural growing cycle. And again, this section is about, do we force ourselves to practice? How do we make peace with the resistance? There's two things you can do to nurture the process. One is to make an altar, but not a physical one, a temporal one. Reserving a place in your daily schedule gives practicing the time to happen. Eventually, your practice time becomes a bright corner of your day, a haven, a meeting with a friend who gives you stuff you didn't have before, like learning any type of new skill or new habit or new love. Clearing the forest is part of building the house. It takes a lot of energy to clear a little bit of land. And he's talking about clearing the time. And he says, even telephoning counts. When you're dialing the number of the babysitter, you can say to yourself, I'm doing music now. So it all counts. It's all part of the intention. He talks about the ace of practice as if like the ace up your sleeve. He says, make a no-nonsense deal with yourself to write down the night before the time you intend to practice the next day and for how long. For instance, on Tuesday evening, write Wednesday, 2:00, 20 minutes. And write that down and carry it with you. And as doing that, you will put your attention to that place and make it more likely that you will practice by setting that clear intention to practice. So that's a little suggestion. I'm not surprised to see that suggestion, given some of what we've seen about, like the recent book talk on Getting It Done, or The Power of Habits, which again talked about the research behind writing things down. There's a wonderful section about overcoming resistance called I'm a Dork. That's IMA, new word, DORK. It says the practice of music can push every button you have, especially the one that puts yourself down. Sometimes I think my mantra is I'm a dork, or something like that. And he proceeds to write later in this section, not having the right stuff is the American nightmare. When we seem to lack our quota of power or ability, we get scared. And from this fear comes self-anger. This is a deep problem, and I don't know the solution, but I do know that music can be learned only one way, by absorption in vibration. A mind immersed in the sound of sound does not have room for angry captions. So when I read that, I read it again. A mind immersed in the sound of sound does not have room for angry captions. When you hear that disparaging critic, don't try to shut it up because it can out-talk you. Slow down, take a deep breath, stand up, turn around, shake hands with the good energy in your striving, then fight vinegar with honey. Zero in on the sweet sound of musical sound. Your self-nagger may seem all-consuming and out of control, but musical tone has greater power than even that voice. Wonderful encouragement to keep going in the face of resistance. He talks about, there's sections here on disusable notions, like how to respond to the voice that says, I'm not musical, or you have to learn other people's music before you learn your own, or music from the rest of the world isn't as advanced as ours. There's a section here on the best excuses. I don't feel like it. I'm not inspired, but everybody's listening, etc. Just some great practical advice here. One thing I might call out here is the section, but everybody's listening, meaning what will they think? I will be judged, etc. I'm not comfortable because people are listening to my practicing. It's not my best work, etc. And this certainly translates over to our professional work that we might do, right? Well, it's not finished yet. I don't know if I want people to see it, if it's not quite perfect, etc. He said, so everybody is listening except you. They're listening to your music and you're listening to them. If you're practicing within your rightful territory, which means not aggressively disturbing them, respecting neighborly boundaries, etc. If you're practicing within your rightful territory, their listening is likely to be in your imagination. The chatter you hear is really your own chatter. When you practice, practice for you. When you daydream about what others hear, you miss the essence of your labor. Listen more keenly and forgivingly to your work and leave others to do their own work. Be an audience of one. Great advice, again, for overcoming this resistance or this critical mind. He talks about overcoming mistakes. And as he says, the goal is not to make music free of mistakes. The goal is to be complete in learning and to grow well. Lots of sections here. I'm skimming over some things in the interest of time. There's a lot here. And just some really good suggestions. There's another section here in the practicing part of the book called There's Not Much to Learn and It Takes Forever. He said, ingrained in our culture is the goal of sleek success. It's not a big surprise when students, especially adults, are put off by how long it takes to learn simple things. They say, I become so aware of the part of me that thinks she ought to know how to do it. And he says, the reply is, there is no ought to know how. There's only the uncovering ourselves as we sit at the polishing stone. So again, change the focus from the quality of the result that we may judge we should be achieving at this moment in time to the process of learning and the enjoyment of it. And finally, in this practicing section, he ends it with a brief chapter, section, 3 pages called Originality. It's not original. What I'm doing isn't original, and we judge ourselves because something isn't original. And he quotes Jane Hirschfield here on the question of originality. He said, origin is from the Latin oriri, meaning to rise, is a rising up from earth of a subterranean spring. Originality rises from your underground truth. When you have passion for the truth about yourself, originality will percolate up through your work. When you go for the truth, originality takes care of itself. In your passion to uncover yourself, you become transparent. In that transparency, your deep particularity becomes visible. Originality, writes Hirschfield, comes at its deepest level from a virtual transparency of the ego. This is really interesting, right? In the pursuit of truth, our originality comes forward. Our authentic gifts comes forward. There's a concept called the Pythagorean triangle that we might talk about in a later book talk that relates to that. Are we giving to the truth as opposed to giving for something in return? Originality comes at its deepest level from a virtual transparency of the ego in which the world and self open to each other. And this is the real gem here. Originality, one can say, is what you step out of the way of as it makes its way through. The next section is called The Sound Connection, about how to develop the music inside you. There's a section here about finding a teacher, which really correlates neatly, I think, with finding a coach or finding a mentor. And he says the first step in doing that is to create a lucid picture of what you want. And in clarifying what you want, you're more likely to attract the teacher that you want, which I think is absolutely true. And that's one of the reasons we do visualizations, exercises, and letters from the future and cover stories and other activities like that to help us zero in on the future. And that can certainly help us attract coaches, mentors, or other resources that can help us along the way. He talks about the fear of music and something that can get in the way as well, right? He said we can basically be afraid. Let me start again. We can be afraid of anything: statues, love, moths, water. But I think we basically have two fears: death and our deep selves. Many forms of fear slow our bodies to a crawl and confuse our minds. We need a clue to recognize fear, no matter the disguise. Our own resistance is that clue. When we feel resistance, we know we're in fear. Whenever you resist what you want to do, fear is present. Poor concentration is fear. Procrastination, lack of coordination, diversionary tactics, hunger, doodling are fear. Fear is not bad, but unconscious fear is unconscious. Making the unconscious conscious is like opening your eyes in the dark. It's the work of waking up. And there's been a lot written about that, of course. But the way he ties it back to the artistry of music is he says artists must constantly guard against these hidden expectations that flap around their natural gift like dark birds. I think that's a lovely, lovely way to put it. And finally, later in this section called The Sound Connection, there's a really interesting little piece in here called Age Matters. And it's about being willing to be a student, being willing to develop new skills, new passions at any age. And as he says, start with where you are every time, no exceptions. Let your appreciation for what you already have become be preeminent. Then there will be an ecstasy to beginning something new, especially if you're old enough to see the arc of your life and the circle it is part of. You are never too old to learn music or too young. The trick is to identify continuously with the act of self-discovery in the moment. And he says, remember, you are wiser than you were even last week, and your heart and your ears are bigger. Remind yourself to keep listening for the new and what seems to be the old and familiar. You may hear for the first time something that has been singing to you all along. And that's a beautiful invitation, I think. The next section is called Practices, which is really literally tools and techniques for practicing instruments. I'm not going to spend much time on this, other than the way he describes the section by saying each person needs different limits to set him or her free. Finding your limits is what practice is about. This is the most essential work of your teacher or coach, though sooner or later you learn to invent useful limits for yourself. And he proceeds to outline a number of different practices, literally musical practices, that help train us. And the very last section, which I'm really calling the conclusion, but it's one of the 5 sections in the book, is called Big Ears. And I'll tell you what he means by that by reading a story, which he shares. It's a lovely story. He says, in earlier years, I first began to go to the concerts of my teacher, my musical teacher. After the concert, people would stand around quietly smiling and say to him, "Thank you, thank you." In those same years, I gave day-long seminars during the day and then a concert at night. After the seminars, people would come and say, "Thank you so much." And in the evening, after a concert of my own improvisations, people would stand around and say, "Very interesting. That's very interesting." He said, this went on for years. I knew something was wrong. And then he said, at one point, I gave an all-day seminar followed by an evening concert. After the seminar, there were 25 people around. They all stood around and said, "Thank you, many thanks." And the evening concert was in the recital hall at Harvard University Music Department. At the end of the concert, people stood around and said, "Very interesting, interesting music. I was very interested." So after the concert, he was sharing a ride with his friend and expressing and sharing his experience. And he realized that he was angry about this distinction between thank you and interest. He said, I realized I was angry. My teacher sings, people say thank you. I teach, people say thank you. I play, people say very interesting. Teach, thank you, play, interesting, very interesting. If one more person tells me my music is interesting, I'm going to kill myself. And he said, my friend, and I love the way this is put here, my friend said softly, "What's the purpose of your life?" And he said, I must have been ready to hear the question because my entire life did become coherent in that moment. I saw that my mission had been to compress the world's music into a personal style, to squeeze the wisdom and beauty of cultures into a many-colored ball, which I threw into the air to win esteem from my listeners. I had studied everything and could demonstrate interrelatedness on all levels. I could use African and Asian and European essences the way Beethoven used themes and weave a planetary counterpoint spontaneously to show that it could be done and that I could do it. Naturally, people found that very interesting. My teaching had taken another tack. And his friend said, yeah, but what's the purpose of your life? And this is what he realized. In teaching, the act of showing off or parading my abilities would be obscene. The object of teaching is to bring others forward, to set useful examples, to foster self-confidence and a love of the medium. You learn to listen to students, not with musically big ears, which recognize pitches and key changes, but with the big ears, capital B, capital E, the big ears of compassion, which recognize desire and pain. Now, he says, rolling through Boston, I realized that my music had gotten stuck because I was trying to prove something. I hadn't stepped out of the way. Whereas in teaching, I did get out of the way. I had nothing to prove. I just gave. Now I had to learn to give my music away. My friend's question framed teaching and music making into one and the same life, a helping life. And he said, I thereafter began to hear music differently. So to me, that's a beautiful close to this book, the recognition of seeing our lives as an opportunity to give, an opportunity to teach, and therefore getting out of our own way. There's nothing to prove. And that is what he said is what helped him bring his most beautiful music forward. So I love that the book closes on that note, and my prepared remarks close on that note. So I would say thank you for joining us and participating. I'd love to hear what you think about this book, of course, as always, but this one in particular, because it really is an invitation to participate in a different way. It doesn't speak to our heads. It invites our hearts and our hands, in my view, which is why it's such a compelling book. And I thank Zach for recommending it. So Zach, any thoughts and comments about the book and what you might add?
Well, thank you for another just excellent presentation on a book. And I'm so glad that you read it. I'm so glad that somebody else gets to read it, and I hope folks listening to this got a lot out of your presentation, because I sure did, even though I've read the book a couple of times.
Right.
And I love that ending story is really powerful, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't remember it. There, I first read the book probably about 25 years ago, something like that.
Right.
Um, so I guess it was relatively new at the time. A lot of my friends at that time, all of my friends pretty much were musicians. And I didn't think I was. I didn't have any musical training. And some of my friends were students of Aladdin Mathieu. Um, so that's kind of how the book came into my world. And what was just wonderful about the book for me is that it didn't say you had to be a musician to read this book.
Right.
And
Good.
even the musical practices, which I do remember some of them from that time, are very simple for the most part. I think there are a couple that are a little trickier, but I really do think this book is for anyone who likes to listen, whether they're a musician or even if somebody who's not into music. That's kind of why I said, oh, this might be a good book uh, for leaders, and that's not necessarily my first world either. But there's so many great lessons which you illuminated in your talk, and even many more that I didn't put the connection on. So I'm really glad that you did. Um,
Yeah, thank you. It's a great little book. Thank you for recommending it. I've already, just in the past few weeks in preparing for this, have talked it up with several friends, including last night with a friend of mine who's been a working jazz musician for 40 years, and he hadn't heard of it, and I'm sending him a copy.
oh, great.
So it's just a lovely invitation, and I think for many of us too, I can't quantify this, but I think for many of us, we've had experiences with music, whether it's playing an instrument ourselves, helping our kid learn an instrument. And I think we can find ourselves in different places of this book, whether it's overcoming our own resistance or supporting a child or helping to elevate music to its proper place as this really supportive and nourishing and just rich part of our lives. So great find. And the book, according to what I read at the beginning, is 31 years old. So it was already old when you found it. So, and it seems to me just as relevant as ever. Maybe a little outdated with the telephone line dial tone thing, but
Yeah.
that's about the only anachronistic thing I could find in there.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is one. Well, I think he makes a reference to paying the phone bill and needing a stamp at some point, which
Yes, yes.
stop it, Frank. But yeah, yeah. No, and the first time I read the book too, he invites to jump around, and I remember doing that. I just kind of pick it up and I'd read a little essay, and then flip to something else. So it's a good book for that as well. As one that you really can just grab an essay and for a couple minutes, check in with it again, which is a beautiful little thing. You don't have to get
Yeah.
deeply invested in the thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's a book that helps provide perspective too. And I know a number of leaders that I've worked with and coached, and even teams, that music is a very important part of their connection. It's an important part of their lives. People have a musical practice, whether it's something that they play or just like they go to the orchestra, and for them it's like a Buddhist retreat. We're wired that way. I didn't want to talk too much about that essential to the book talk, but I do think we're wired that way. Music is within us. We can connect to it one way or the other. I think most of us have had pretty rich experiences with music. Hope so.
Yeah, and I think that he does talk about that in the book, though, a little bit, just about the communal aspect of music, and how in some cultures no one is a musician or isn't a musician. Everyone participates in the musical life in many cultures. Not necessarily ours, but in our culture, we do have this kind of hierarchical, that is a musician because they've studied for this long. Yeah. So it's it's an interesting way to look at it throughout the world, and just us as humans, the origin of societies, and yeah, and music is a way to communicate. It's another way to communicate with each other. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm singing and humming to my son before he could talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sure I'm sure some of those, you know, songs are still within him as well now.
I like to think so.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Great. Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Take
Yeah.
care.
Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. All right.